afternoon and a very warm welcome to all of you once again. Dr. Panagariya, honor to have you here. You've donned many hats in your illustrious career, an academician, economist, a believer and proponent of free trade, who's also the first vice chairperson of the Niti Aayog, and now the chairperson of the 16th Finance Commission, a commission that has an extremely important task ahead of itself in the next few years. But Dr. Panagariya, we are here at the Business Today Best Banks event, spans 3 decades, and I want to begin this conversation with you by getting a perspective from you on one of the headlines that has been going around for the last few days, and this is a claim by some economists that India has become more unequal and that those at the top 1% have, in my words, sucked out wealth and income from the rest of the country, and therefore India is becoming a plutocracy. I really don't know whether that's a word that's applicable here, but I toss that question to you. Is it true that India has become more unequal?
Thank you, Siddharth. As always, great pleasure to be with you once again. You mentioned I wear many hats, and so it will be good if I can speak wearing my economist hat. Currently, I sit in the chair of the 16th Finance Commission. That's a neutral body. It's not a government body in a technical sense. It's a constitutional body. So I neither speak for the government or for the commission, but for myself. On the question of inequality, there are many aspects to this, and let me just mention just 2 of these. Your question, of course, was, has inequality risen? Right? So that brings into question one of the 2 aspects I wanted to touch on, which is that inequality has many different measures. And, you can measure inequality through sort of Gini coefficient that economists typically use that tries to give a measure of overall inequality in a group. That group could be a nation, it could be a state, it could be a village, it could be, so that is one measure. But then you can measure rural-urban inequality, you can measure top 1% relative to the bottom 10%, you can measure the wages of the skilled to unskilled, wages in the organized sector to unorganized sector. With all these measures, if you are really after alarming people, you can always find a measure which shows rising inequality. Now, particular one that you mentioned, top 1% having 23% of the, was it wealth or income?
Income and wealth both.
So that's a common one that alarmists love to use. Now, the point is that if a country is generating wealth, somebody will have to generate that wealth. And even if they were keeping 2 or 3% of that wealth for themselves and then distributing the rest of it across the rest of the population, by sheer numbers, when you got, 1.4 billion population, you will get that kind of distribution. So you could choose not to create wealth and everybody could stay poor, or you could create wealth and some people will get wealthier. I don't lose sleep over that. Because after a point, the owner of the wealth really is the main function of it is not so much the consumption of wealth, although some consumption does happen, there is no doubt. But allocate how do
So I think this is better. Okay. Sorry about that.
So it's a matter of how you allocate that wealth for further growth. So do you do it productively or not? So that's one aspect. The second aspect I want to bring out, and I'm going to tell you just a quick anecdote on that. That one fine morning, I read the Wall Street Journal, and it has a headline saying that in New York City, there is a whole billionaires row. These are, apartment buildings, 3 or 4, where mostly billionaires live. And the penthouse in one of those buildings had gone for $250 million. No, you think I slept any worse that night than I had slept the previous night? It was fine. It was a curious, okay, very interesting. And I'm living in the backyard of the billionaires, which is fine. So it is also an issue of what kind of inequality really offends us. And generally, the kind of inequality that offends us, that concerns us, or the inequality over which we lose sleep, is within our own immediate social context.
Right.
And so, if I have a colleague at Columbia, he is given a salary increase of 20%, I get only 5%. That really is something over which I lose the sleep. But if Bloomberg makes another billion or 5 billion in any given year, it doesn't matter to me. So I think one has to, as opposed to poverty, about which we should care immensely, and about which I certainly care immensely.
Which was my next quick question before we move on. The other attached bit is this claim that's been, and you have, I think, reflected on this in the past, about the reduction of poverty in India. Now, one set of opinion and data suggests that poverty has gone down, and while there was a blip, a hit due to COVID all across the world and in India, we are doing better. The other side says no, there is a question mark on the data, and this is not a fact that India has pulled so many people out of poverty in the last 10 years. Where do you stand as an economist and a teacher on this matter, sir?
Now, actually the latest survey has just come out, 2022-23. This is the consumption expenditure survey, last of which, or previous one of which, was in 11-12. Okay? So these are very comparable surveys, and if anything, the new one perhaps overstates poverty a little bit rather than understate it, for reasons that are a little technical, into which I will not go here. Anybody who is interested, ask me, I will explain. There actually, so our poverty in 11-12 comparable expenditure survey was somewhere around 20% or so, if I remember correctly. In this one, for which the full unit level data is still to be released, but given what has been released, it is pretty clear that the extreme poverty, or the kind of usual World Bank poverty line that we use, $1.90 at purchasing power parity, extreme poverty has fallen below 3 or 4% from 20%. And there is, you will have to stretch to question that, because these are very comparable surveys.
So extreme poverty has fallen from 20% to 3 or 4%, and that's a very important bit of data. I move on to another point, and this is the most recent data. And I was anchoring the GDP data program, and those live numbers come, and for a moment I was speechless when we saw the latest quarterly data, and I wanted to be doubly sure that we haven't made a typo, mistake or error. But sir, many people seem to be questioning that data, and one set of data, analysts say that this is on account of a very significant increase on the tax side. But the other says, Indian data is suspect, particularly in the last 10 years it's been fudged. There is autocracy in data collection and dissemination also. You've dealt with Indian data for years. Is it true that India's GDP data is being fudged, particularly in the last 10 years?
My late brother, who was a very distinguished neurologist and a Padma Shri awardee, he used to tell me that brain works like Velcro for negative news, and like Teflon for positive news. And so some people really have recognized this kind of asymmetry, and have, made it a business to stay in limelight, to continuously question the GDP data. Any good news is questioned, either by appeal to the quality of the data, or the government's intention to fudge them, or something else. But it's not that easy to fudge the GDP growth data. What you are fudging is the GDP to do that. So if this year I fudged the GDP to raise the growth rate by 2%, I hike the GDP by 2%. Next year, this GDP becomes my base GDP, over which now I'm going to calculate the growth rate. So I have to fudge 4% to get the 2% increase, 2% extra growth in the next year. Third year, I have to fudge 6%. Very quickly, it will get out of hand. I'll get caught. That's not so easy. So that's just one way to explain it. And the GDP data collection is a very involved exercise. I mean, it's not like, you're collecting one number so you can easily fudge it. It's a mass of numbers that are being collected, and ultimately it's the aggregate of that. Now, very quickly, you mentioned about this tax revenue. There was a lot of this sentiment expressed by a lot of the experts, actually, I must say, that, because they turned out to be wrong in their forecasts by several miles. And so, therefore, they go in and say that, the GVA, the gross value added, which is the calculation of output at factor prices, has grown by 6.5%, and that's about right, that's what we expected. But the 8.3 or what have you, that is not because, that's just tax revenue. No, if you're an economist, that borders nonsense. Because there is output associated with tax revenue also.
Absolutely.
The government commands control of certain amount of output or certain amount of resources that is associated with that tax revenue. So that tax revenue is in no way anything less of an output than the rest of the GVA is.
Dr. Panagariya, I've covered the Indian economy, been fortunate to do that for well over 20 years now. And prior to 2014, there used to be questions about data where, for instance, the inflation data wasn't being updated for months on months. But I now see an ideological bias. And I wonder why that happens. Dr. Raghuram Rajan, Dr. Arvind Subramaniam, and many others, there's this constant note of criticism, question, doubt over India's economic performance, structural turnaround, jobs, poverty elimination. Why does that happen? And I ask this to you as a student, sir.
Well, I thought I answered that question actually. Remember I said something about Velcro and something about wanting to be in limelight. So you constantly, if you're going to question that, you have to pinpoint what is your source. Why do you think that this is wrong? And then suggest how to improve it. At the end of the day, this methodology that is being used currently was not advised by the present government at all in the first place, actually. These are series at prices of 2011-12. And there was a National Statistical Commission which had suggested the improvements and the changes. And this is anyway usually an ongoing process, but in this case, new sources, the company data, the MCA data, were incorporated into the GDP calculations, and that was at the recommendation of a commission which actually was appointed by the previous government, of which, one of the two economists you mentioned was a part, at least of the government. So, and mind you, this is I was at the Niti Aayog for 3 years, and the MOSPI is a professional body. And it has some of our best statisticians working in there. They are people of integrity. So when you really question the integrity of the data, you are questioning the integrity of those individuals. I remember, the GDP data, even as the Vice Chairman of the Niti Aayog, I will find out only a few hours before they will be announced publicly.
Yes.
And likewise, the rest of the government too. And we were informed only because media questions will start coming, and therefore we had to be prepared to answer. But if fudging had to be done, then, extensive discussions would be happening, of which I would have been a part.
Absolutely, a conspiracy cannot be hatched by one person. That's a good point. Let's come to another point, and this is jobless growth, K-shaped recovery. Again, dominates headlines, and the point that is made is that while India is growing at the aggregate level, it is not necessarily translating into significant job growth, and people at the lower end of the income spectrum have been suffering a double whammy, higher inflation and lesser wage increment as well.
So I like to put it a little differently. When we say it's jobless, somehow we think of unemployment massively rising and all. I have always maintained that India's problem is not unemployment really. And if you actually literally interpret the data that we are collecting, this is the periodic labor force survey, which is very credible, consistent and all. And that is actually showing steady decline in the unemployment rate. So in this sense, certainly, the jobs are being created. Now, the problem I think still is that we are not creating good jobs. And as a result, the productivity levels in India remain low. And that is where I think the problem is what I often call underemployment. A job that, with some bit of capital could be done by one person, because of that lack of capital is done by 3 or 4 persons. And that of course means automatically that output per worker is low. And that is something that we need to do something about. One way that you can see this is, you got 45% of the workforce in agriculture, another 45% in the micro and small enterprises. I'm not even saying MSME, I'm just saying MS, micro and small. That's 90% of the workforce. The output per worker of both of these, agriculture as well as those working in micro and small enterprises, is very low.
So one small quick point before I move on from the macro to the micro and banking. In your sense, do you feel that AI will further worsen this aspect, especially of people at the lower end of the spectrum, where the quality of jobs, incomes will get challenged by greater technological adoption in India as well?
These are things which are very, very difficult to predict, and I hate to, lean one or the other way. I remember, when the desktop computers first came, we all thought that, this is going to eliminate all the secretarial jobs and all. And certainly in the beginning it looked like that, because we were all given these desktops, and so whereas previously we used to have our papers typed in by the typists in the office, we started typing our own papers. But in the end, it is the nature of the job changed. The positions, none of those positions actually disappeared. So, in general, particularly when any technology increases productivity, it reduces costs. And that allows actually the sector to expand. And so, whereas some types of jobs may go away, other jobs replace them, and rising productivity then is accompanied by rising output as well. And that is to the benefit of all.
Dr. Panagariya, we are at the 28th edition of Business Today Banking Awards, and over the years we have not only awarded the best performing banks and financial institutions, but in a way this event, this ceremony in its various forms has also tracked the evolution of Indian banking. The question that I have for you is from an era of phone banking, as was said. Do you believe that our banking system, particularly the public sector part of it, has been transformed permanently in some ways, and we've now moved to what I would like to call Atmanirbhar digital banking from an era of phone banking?
Well, digital banking is probably a small part of the banking. I think, we're still doing a lot of, the bulk of banking is still the conventional banking. And to be sure, in the past when we have spoken, we have talked about the NPAs, which were massive at some point in time. And when at Niti Aayog, I greatly worried about all this. That episode is now behind us. But, I hate to be sort of duped once again into thinking that now we are in a very secure zone. It is true that perhaps under the current administration there is no phone banking going on, but that, finance is a strange animal. In what way it is going to come back to, recreate itself in all the NPAs, etc., is hard to predict. But our own history has been, this was not the first episode, by the way, it was the biggest one so far, but it was not the first, it was at least a second and possibly third episode of these NPAs happening. And one thing you see, which is very asymmetric, is that all the money that the government had to invest was invested in the public sector banks. Government did not invest anything in the private sector banks. It did rescue one of the banks, but in the end, no public money actually got lost in doing so. So I personally still think, I have not changed my mind, this is in fact a good opportunity when the banks are now in good health, right? When they're in bad health, there is always the refrain that, they are undervalued, and therefore if you privatize, will not get their full value. Well, right now, they are flourishing, they have a solid value. This is a good time to privatize. I think the government should not, again, this is my economist hat. So I think this will be a good time when the government comes back in its next term to start seriously privatizing some of the banks. This is going to be a very long drawn process anyway, so it's not an issue of that you're going to privatize all public sector banks, but the process should begin because I still think that in the end the commercial pressure is required for banking to be efficient, like any other manufacturing or other kind of activity. Any commercial activity, basically the pressure of the markets is very important. And we can, as privatization progresses, you can assess and judge whether the privatized banks are actually doing better than those that would not have been yet privatized. And then take a call on the other banks at that stage. But that process really, I think, does need to begin soon.
Oh, those are important words considering what has happened with IDBI Bank, the sale process. In the time that we have left, I want to ask you to wear another hat, and this is the free trade hat, which is very important for all of us because free trade and the reforms that happened 2.5, 3 decades ago in India have delivered growth as well as prosperity and job creation. How do you read the situation in the Chinese economy, because that also impacts the world? As of now, do you think China is out of the woods, or do you suspect that it will continue to flounder for the near future?
Well, one thing is certain, that the 10% growth that we were observing in China is now behind us. That is not coming back. The experience is, and China is probably the 5th country, counting Hong Kong, so Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea. These are the 4 countries before China that had grown for about 3 decades at rates that were 9 to 10%. After 3 decades, when you get to 4th, it usually drops to somewhere between 5 and 7, and you get to the 5th decade, it drops to below 5. So even without any of the other things, any of the other shocks, what have you, Chinese growth was certainly ready to drop. In addition, now also, it seems to me that the Chinese leadership has done things that were detrimental to the business environment. And so it has doubled down in a way, so already the growth rate that was declining got another negative shock through the actions of the government.
Right.
And so there I think, in my assessment now, we'll probably not see a growth rate of China that is more than 5%, more likely 4-3%.
Right.
That's where we are.
Can we sustain 8% growth in India? Because in the past, when we have grown at fast rates, our economy is said to have overheated. Do you think India can now continue to grow at 8% plus?
No, I won't say that the economy had overheated in any way. I think we made mistakes. And this was the second term of the United Progressive Alliance when a lot of mistakes got made. And that is what set back the growth rate. And then, of course, the banking crisis, the NPAs took their toll. We are very much capable of sustaining 8% growth. I maintained actually if we do the right things, including one on trade, we certainly have the prospects of getting to 9-10%. There is no reason, in my view, why we cannot do that. A lot of the reforms have happened. Some we have talked about, privatization, the labor laws have to be implemented. Some land market issues have to be tackled also. They're a little bit harder because states have to do those. But even without that, I think 7 to 8% I have maintained, and it but for the COVID period and the 2019-20 when growth rate dipped because of the banking and non-bank finance companies crisis, NBFC crisis. If you take that out, I think we have maintained actually, and even including that, even if you include that in dollar terms, in real dollars, growth rate over the 20 years ending in 22-23 was 7.9%, which is almost 8%.
Almost 8%. So quickly, just one quick follow-up before one final question. And this is to do with free trade agreements. After some years of sort of staying away, India is now in the midst of negotiating several agreements. Some work has happened on an early harvest. But would you say that Modi 3.0 should focus on trade and go ahead with free trade agreements and drop some of the inhibitions that we have seen in the past?
100%. Absolutely. I think that is imperative, that is essential. I would love to see us also knock down the tariff barriers across the spectrum, meaning across all countries. That's probably not going to happen. And so the next best really is these free trade agreements. Now the free trade agreements also in some ways come together with our geopolitics, because the government clearly wants to move away from China, and the best way to do that is
Can the return of President Trump sort of wreck what is left of the global free trade order?
Well, we'll see, there is some rhetoric of that kind that's coming in. But, certainly President Trump was very much for reciprocity. So if on a reciprocal basis, he will keep his own barriers low, I have no problem with that. We should lower our trade barriers. That is good for us. So if reciprocity will do it, I think we can still remain in business. But we have to be willing to engage reciprocally. And by the way, free trade agreements are all about reciprocity. So, we should first very quickly complete the one with UK, complete the one with the European Union. Then I think we will be very well placed to deal with the United States.
Absolutely. One final question, and this is the task that you've now been given, a constitutional task, extremely important for India's overall growth, which is allocation of resources, central state, the Finance Commission. You just started work, so I'm not going to ask you to tell us what you're doing, but one question is right up there, which is this feeling which is also stoked by politics about a north-south divide and how the south is suffering on account of the north, which lags in certain economic indicators, and that leading to a debate where certain people say that the south is being discriminated against and is bearing the burden of lesser performing northern states.
I mean, this is a sort of politically charged question, but if I really look at it carefully as an economist, it's not a north-south question. There are other states. You got Maharashtra, you got Gujarat, you got Haryana, you got Goa. Punjab used to be actually a very star performer at one point. It's now kind of declined a bit. But there are richer states in the north also. So it is more about states that have performed well and states that have not performed so well. Part of it, of course, is legacy because some of the states actually started out poorer at independence. You know, a lot of the princely states, but also Bihar, Assam. These were states, and if you go back to the history, by the constitutional debates that were happening when these provisions on the Finance Commission were negotiated in the Constitutional Assembly, this was a big issue, you know, the Bihar, or Odisha actually, Odisha in particular, but also Assam, making a big plea that, look, you know, and you should read the language, you know, they really describe the finance department as it used to be, as finance ministry used to be called then, as really evil. That, you know, it is really holding on to its resources. What is it? We are the ones, we need it actually, you know, the India, how can it develop? Development, social and economic development is the domain of the provinces. We should get the money. So, you know, this is an age-old debate. It has been kind of put out because probably for you people, you know, in the media, the north-south divide, a kind of simplistic way of looking at it catches the attention. But I think it's a little more nuanced than that. You know, you got geographically many of the well-performing states also in the north.
Absolutely, Dr. Panagariya. I know that the report of the Finance Commission will definitely try and do justice to every single citizen of India. Dr. Panagariya, thank you very much for your time with us here today. You've flown here only for this, so we are deeply grateful for the time that you made out to be here. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you.